Good morning. I think Ted was terrific this morning. As Ted talked about his crazy ideas, it's always nice when you see somebody else who has several of the same crazy ideas that you do. It makes you feel somewhat less by yourself, at least. So I think there are a lot of things that are important about what he had to say. One of the trends that clearly emerged from that is the change that social gaming has had on the landscape of gaming overall. I don't have my numbers exactly in front of me, but something on the order of 25 million customers in about 1990 made up the majority of the console and PC business. And today, something like 1.6 billion people play mobile, social, and other games. That is as dramatic a change as you can describe. What's come with that is a bunch of new customers with a bunch of new expectations and a bunch of new different ways of playing and paying and talking about what they do. And so social gaming has brought lots of other new constructs with it. Some of it has to do with the technology involved. I thought what we're talking about in our panel are the things that social gaming has changed, the opportunities that creates, the legal frameworks for that, and we'll see what different people have to say. I'm going to try and introduce the panel badly, and so they'll correct me, I'm sure. So I'll start with the guy on my right. The guy on my right's a guy named Tom Mustaine. I'm trying to remember when I first met Tom, but in his first...
Mikosina in Dallas.
Yes, that's right.
About Mule.
Would that have been about... Let's see here. I'm trying to remember. Ritual, first incarnation.
Yeah. Ritual was based out of a house.
That's right. Yeah, a long time ago. So anyway, we talked to Ritual about a development agreement once upon a time, and although we didn't land them, we got them a really good deal with somebody else. Unfortunately, he had to then work with those guys, so that's his own fault. Anyway, Tom's done a number of things. Tom's been one of the leading designers in the first-person shooter space for a long time. I think he's worked on every major franchise that there is in that space in one way, shape, or form. He's been an innovative guy in thinking about how to use first-person shooters with other gaming forms. And in his latest, we've done other crazy things together, like built the Nintendo Wii Netflix client together, of all crazy things. But what Tom's off to his new adventures today that are around social gaming, and we'll see if we can squeeze more information at him later on that. To my left here is Joseph Olin. I've known Joseph a little less time than Tom, but not a lot. Joseph's done a number of things in the industry over his course. One of the places he's highest profile is he's the past president of the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences. And in his most recent incarnation, he's working with Chris Swain from USC to bring a number of those kind of university-seeded products to market in the social gaming space. And then we've got Carolyn Luedtke at the end here. Carolyn's an attorney for, unlike the rest of us, she got a real education. At least us two.
Oh, yeah.
So she has represented Rambus, let's see here, Playdom, lots of other players in the tech business. She's one of those people who went to Harvard and did it all the right way, and then she went to Princeton and did it all the right way. And so making me feel completely inadequate for the lack of education that I have. So anyway, she's done a number of great things. I think she's going to provide a great deal of context to us about what some of the real risks are. So what I thought I'd do is start by asking the panel, what are the things that they have seen social gaming change? What are the new areas of emphasis? And I think we'll start with Tom, since he's the latest guy to this front here.
All right. Well, just recently in the last year transitioned over to kind of the social space. Prior to that, we spent, my last company was Escalation Studios. We were recently acquired last week by a company called Six Waves Law Labs. But we spent the last year focusing pretty heavily on Facebook and on mobile iOS and trying to bridge the gap between the two. And there's an opportunity there that we find pretty interesting, which is that the people who play in those spaces, similar to what you see with hardcore players on Xbox or PS3, the people that live gaming, people who play these games in the social spaces live it the same way. They just have a different kind of creative and IP focus. And so it's been an interesting challenge to attempt to transition from, like Rich mentioned, I've built mostly shooters and first-person games my whole career, but seeing the opportunity in social and in mobile, transitioning that space has been pretty interesting. Just getting these people that are really socially connected, that have a bit of, and there's legal issues with this, of course, but their privacy is kind of a question mark sometimes. It's like, yeah, I accept that, no problem. Which allows us to do some cool stuff as a developer, but also it creates new legal risks that we have to be aware of. So it's been an interesting transition, but it's been a big opportunity because the market is huge. There's been a lot to learn.
Joseph?
The market is huge, and I think it's the exciting part. And when Ted talked about, you know, the early days of the business, and it's a garage band mentality, and that I think over the course of a short 24 months, the garage band mentality, I think, still has some valid levels of participation within social, but I'd say it to be very effective and competitive today. It's a much larger band. You've got backup singers and a whole lot more things to worry about, to where in dealing with the students at the SC and certainly at the Guildhall, all of a sudden you realize you can't really say you're going to be successful with 3 to 5 guys doing a little, you know, flash-based game, and you'll get it up there, and all of a sudden there'll be traction. And you have to approach it as a business to be successful as a creative force. And if you don't think of it as a business, I think it's very difficult to be successful. And as soon as you say business, that means you need to be protected in a variety of ways, because this is the Wild West, and the legal issues in starting up 2 companies this past 8 months were completely unexpected in terms of the things that we all of a sudden found ourselves knee-deep in. And when you're knee-deep in legal issues, you're not knee-deep in programming.
All right, so I thought I would give a few sort of perspectives on things that have changed in the social gaming industry that can affect your day-to-day life. I actually made a PowerPoint, because I'm the lawyer here.
Because she's prepared. And we're glad to have her.
So I have, in the last 2 years, my practice has become almost 100% litigating with social gaming companies. And one of the big takeaways in litigating with social gaming companies is it is, as Joseph said, it's the Wild West. Many of the social gaming clients that I represent and that we see out there don't have in-house legal departments. And if they do, they're usually focused on corporate issues, and they're not focused on litigation issues. So we find that in this industry that I think has become pretty litigious, there's a lot of big lawsuits out there, largely, in my view, driven by Zynga. That's who seems to sue all of my clients. And these lawsuits...
They're your whale.
They are my whale. These lawsuits come on hot. So the lawsuits in the social gaming space often are big, they happen big. There are companies trying to get shut down or games trying to get shut down fast. And I think for social gaming companies that don't have in-house legal departments, that presents big challenges, because you don't have an infrastructure like Microsoft or Electronic Arts or a big established company to immediately mobilize. So that's one thing that's certainly different about, I'll give you a headline. So one of my clients that I represented this year was Vastu, which is a large South American social gaming company that Zynga filed. And the way Vastu found out they were sued was this headline in TechCrunch that was, "War, Zynga sues the hell out of Brazilian clone Vastu." So imagine sitting there in your startup, a bunch of gaming people who are focused on just making kick-ass games, and all of a sudden you look on TechCrunch and you find out that you've been sued the hell out of, and that Zynga wants to shut you down, and has obtained an injunction to shut you down within 48 hours. So you have 48 hours to scramble, find counsel, employ a legal defense, and try to save your company. And this is not unusual. This has happened to a lot of social gaming companies out there. So what does that mean for you? I think it means at whatever point you have enough money to invest in a lawyer, it's a good investment in this space to give you good advice. And it means, you know, you need to be on your toes, that if this happens, you have to act quickly and try to put in protective measures while you can, which we can talk about what some of those are. Another thing that I think is really different about social gaming, and maybe it's as much 2012 as social gaming, is the world is really mobile right now. I mean, we hear about people changing jobs all the time. People are freely flowing between companies. It's unusual to have somebody like Rich, who's been at a company for as long as he has.
Forever.
And so we have, you know, every day on Inside Social Games, we get these announcements of who's changed jobs and who's going where. And a lot of this mobility implicates intellectual property issues, trade secret issues, and we see that that's something that's happening a lot in the social gaming space. One of my clients in 2009 was Playdom, who at that time actually was a small company. It's now a big part of Disney. But it was sued by Zynga for hiring 11 people from Zynga who allegedly took information with them, game ideas, documents, and whatnot. And as you all sit there living on your laptops, flash drives moving back and forth, putting stuff up in the Google Cloud, we heard Ted talk about the importance of the cloud. We're all living in the cloud. All of our data's up there. You change jobs, and you're not careful, you take all that stuff with you, and you can create real risks for the next social gaming company you work for. So that's something that, with some protective measures in place, working with a lawyer to make sure that when you hire people from competitors, you talk to them and they don't bring over that information with you, you can try to avoid what happened to Playdom, which was, again, it got an injunction from Zynga with no notice that on 2 days they had to take a forensic image of every computer of every game designer in their whole company, and they ended up in a 1.5 year long litigation over, whether avatar customization is a trade secret and things like that. Which leads to, it's a deal-heavy industry. So Tom was saying his company just got acquired, which is very exciting. We have acquisitions happening every day almost, it seems like, in the social gaming industry. And one thing, because of this just huge amount of deal flow, I think more than you saw back in just a more traditional gaming industry, you have to be careful about what you're talking about in those discussions with potential either acquirers or when you're being acquired. We see that right now Zynga is involved in a big lawsuit with a company called Social Apps, which built My Farm, which was one of the very first games, farming social games. And they've been sued by Thomas Girardi, who, if you watched Aaron Brockovich, is the big plaintiff's lawyer who was in Aaron Brockovich. He's sued Zynga and to say that basically all of Farmville's code was stolen from Social Apps as part of an initial acquisition discussion, where they sat down and they shared some of their code with Zynga to try to get Zynga to purchase them. And now Social Apps is saying that Zynga used that code in Farmville. So you're going to have to be really careful when you're having all these big deal conversations about whether you're going to share your secrets, your secret sauce, and tell how much do you want to impress them, have a non-disclosure agreement in place, and if you're somebody like Zynga or Electronic Arts or Six Waves, do you really want to learn that information and subject yourself to a potential allegation that you've stolen stuff? So that's something I think that's new. I mean, a lot of stuff's happening right now. I don't know if you had that experience when...
Absolutely. We had to do a whole lot of training. Thankfully, though, we came from a more traditional Dallas space, and the Dallas rules have been kind of a little more lax than the California rule book. But now we get our hands on California employment agreements, and we're starting to bring in California employees and facing a number of issues with that kind of stuff. Specifically, during the acquisition, we learned some trade secrets, and we've got NDAs with other developers in the same space. So you've had to tell all our people, you cannot talk about this, this, and this, and if this issue comes up, you better originate it in a different way. So that's been a big education process for us. And down in Dallas, we're like, oh, okay, we'll just flow with the punch, let our attorneys tell us what to do, and then we'll let people know internally how to handle it. And
So why don't we start by talking about that one? We'll start at the bottom of your list, or are you done?
I had one more, which is the copyright issues. All right, so the last one
That's a
is...
good one, too, 'cause it's on my list.
All right, so the last one is... So copyright. So for those of you who don't know copyright, a big thing in... there we go. Copyright law is, how much is original out there in the social gaming space, which is a really interesting conversation given that there's so much fast following and so much is derivative. And then the sons of fair doctrine. For if you know copyright law, sons of fair doctrine is, if you have a farm game, of course it's going to have a barn. And of course it's going to have a cow. And there's only so many ways you can depict a barn and a cow. And so there are some things that are just inherent in the context of that game. Going back to there's case law on karate games and golf games and whatnot. So, in one of the lawsuits that I had this year, it was this Vastu lawsuit. And one of the things, this is a picture from Zynga's complaint. So Zynga put in their complaint pictures from farming games, city games, restaurant management games, pet care games, and poker games. Those were the 5 games they sought to shut down at Vastu. And they put their complaint was filled with pictures trying to show, on the left here we have Zynga's Cityville, the aerial image, and on the right we have Vastu's megacity. And they tried to say, look, Vastu copied Zynga. And the interesting thing is twofold. First of all, so this is what I filed in response to that. I said, whoa, look at all these other city games. This is just the way city games look. You build streets.
The originator, by the way.
Yep.
So SimCity is...
I have a SimCity in there. Actually, SimCity is in there. And so that goes to the question of originality.
Yeah.
Right here, Rich, you'll like this one. So they did restaurants, and now they have the originator, Playfish. So Playfish... This is the picture they put in their complaint and tried to say, look, they're copying restaurant games. Look how similar those look. And so in my response, I said, look at all the restaurant games. And in fact, Zynga copied Playfish. This is just first of all, they're not original. And second of all, it's sons of fair. If you're going to have a restaurant, of course you're going to have tables and you're going to have waiters and you're going to have food being served. So I think this is a really interesting hot issue in social gaming because there's so much fast following. And that is, at what point is this copyright infringement? How much have you really copied the look and feel? Or how much have you just followed on? A poker game's going to have a dealer, and the dealer's probably going to be a blonde woman wearing a black dress, and the poker game's going to have cards and a green table.
And it's going to have
Yeah.
pretty much the same rules.
So those are sort of the interesting issues, I think, from my experience facing social gaming, some of which are derivative of, you had these same issues in first-person shooter games and whatnot before. But now it's pretty hot. It's moving really fast and really interesting.
I like the copyright one. I'm going to come back to that
Great.
one. So I think the acquisition, let's work backwards from the, it's been a wonderful ending and everybody's happy and you're selling your company off to Blazinga, apparently.
They have a rep out in the lobby.
They do. Can't quite imagine what that would be like. But anyway, there are a couple of interesting things in the space of acquisition. One of them are the risks of the acquired, and one is the risks of the acquirer, and they're really two dramatically different worlds. So, why don't we start from the risk of the acquired? I think you talked about some of the things you had to go through, which was suddenly you're going through the process of integrating your business organization with a business organization that's incorporated in a different state and maybe operates under some different rules. I think. So they're not public in this case. You're not going through that transition. Sometimes, in a lot of cases, what people do is they go through the transition of being a privately run, individually driven social networking game to becoming part of a public company, and suddenly they can't say all the shit they used to say. And they have a hard time with that transition of figuring out what they are and aren't allowed to say. That's a big problem. What are some of the other things you saw?
Well, a lot of the issues related to the IP and secret sauce, for example. We spent probably a good month having rounds of discussions associated with that kind of stuff because of the nature of the litigious nature of what's going on in California with all the various social
So to
stuff.
keep you from giving that away,
Yeah.
I'm gonna ask some leading questions to
All right,
help describe what some of that secret sauce is. So, she talked about the case of source code, and that's one clear thing to my mind. It's almost humorous because most of the source code on the client side of a social networking game is available to you if you know how to use right-click on the average browser. So a lot of that's there, but a lot of what's really the secret sauce actually lies on the other end of the wire. It's on the server side. So that's a collection of things. It's the data you collect. It's how you look at that data. It's how you integrate that data. It's how you analyze it and how you turn that into outcomes. That's the kind of stuff that, in general, defines the value of your social gaming space. So how did you figure out how to express that to your new suitor in a way that you didn't feel like you gave that all away at the same time?
Well, I mean, there are bits of it that we were able to give away because we kind of originated completely separate. But we chose last year, I think we're in a little bit of a unique situation. We chose last year, we're going to jump into Facebook without knowing much about it at all. In fact, we had a bunch of developers that have done nothing but 3D shooters and Unity-based games. And we said, we're going to get everybody into Flash. We're going to jump onto the web, and we're going to play at Facebook, and learned a lot very quickly about some of these issues.
And your programmers too.
Oh yeah, I mean, the programmers are, generally our coders move around a lot from different technologies, so that actually wasn't a big challenge. But as you said, one of the big issues is that the technology kind of back up a little bit. So if you go way back to Quake versus Unreal, right? And those two games shipped, Unreal Tournament, Quake. They were very similar. The gameplay was almost identical. And very, very derivative. But there was no line in the sand between the screenshots of Cityville versus I can't remember the other type.
Mega City.
Mega City.
In fact, there were people who built Unreal levels in Quake
That
and
looked
Quake
exactly
and Quake levels in Unreal. So
Unreal.
literally, you would have moments
It looked
where the
a lot
screenshots are identical, literally identical.
Completely identical. But because there wasn't a lot of derivative work, you knew that Epic had created their own technology and created all their own art and done everything from scratch. You knew it as an industry. And then it had done their own thing as well. But when you all start from Flash is pretty common. Anybody can download Flash and start making games. And the way you have to do it, the way you have to integrate your backend, the way you have to, there's 3 or 4 backend solutions you can write off the shelf. And as a startup, you're going to go right to Amazon or SoftLayer or somebody like that and start working with analytics companies like Contingent or try and build your own. So there's a whole lot of, we jumped right into this pool of everybody's using the same stuff. And when we had a discussion with our team about the things you learned from working with this previous publisher, things you learned from working with this previous game that we developed in a work-for-hire capacity, that's where it became issues. So now, like I said, we have to have a whole lot of discussion with people about that secret sauce is more about what a programmer can sit down and rewrite from scratch than about what tech they're using off the shelf. And so it's kind of an interesting challenge, and we've definitely been doing a lot of education with our team on that, and then working with the new studio, the mothership, for example. They've got their own sets of rules, and thankfully there wasn't too much crossover for us. So we've only got a few areas where we're like, okay, we got to be very careful here, but over here we're totally in the clear. So we're lucky there with that one. Not so much if we were a Silicon Valley startup, I think. So.
We'll get you later then.
Yeah.
Joseph?
The whole problem with the technology, I think, is very acute. The enterprises I've gotten to play with for the last this better part of a year are students started. They come directly out of SC. There were 2 projects that were student projects based on student algorithms that are under patent protection that the University of Southern California ultimately took a small equity stake and put up some labor dollars under the condition that the students involved in creating were a part of the successful enterprise. And the biggest challenge is that there's a difference coming from the world of commercial-driven entertainment or interactive entertainment and student development. And one of our brilliant young mind engineers has won every game jam competition and knows how to create coding solutions very quickly. That has nothing to do with building code that will last and be tested and used by tens of thousands of people concurrently. And there's a real mental gap in getting a team to think about building for others as opposed to building for your own solutions. So this is sort of what I walked into, and oh yes, there was the fact that there was angel capital involved, and that was about done. So it was, how do you quickly raise money? What's playable? What can you show? Because everyone wants to believe that the world of Facebook or social games is just lined with money. It's San Francisco or California, 1847, that just wherever you went, you'd grab something. And we have discovered that the same...
I've been there 30 years. I've never found that place. Still looking for it.
You're in landfill off of Foster
Apparently,
City.
it's my fault.
Gold doesn't float. That was the test.
That's the problem.
So part of my regimen was to bring in business practices and actually use some of the same techniques that core game development has always had in terms of establishing goals, accountability, and actually setting hard measurable benchmarks so that the team could figure out if they were making progress, and at the same time sort of freezing the wherewithal of all the fast following that goes on. It wasn't more than 3 or 4 or 5, 6 times a day that there weren't 15 new features that people wanted to add based on something else that they'd seen. And to a certain extent, and I have no idea what Ted is going through with his social game incubator within Insomniac, but there's a whole different mindset between working on a core game and this, it's got to move, it's got to move, it's got to move, and then everyone wants to iterate based on the feature they just saw from someone else's game, and it's like, stop.
Which creates such a risk, like the lawyer just gets so nervous because it's like, that means you're probably not involving a lawyer in all those iterations, and you find yourselves with somebody declaring war and TechCrunch on you.
So I want to follow up on that, but there was one little point in there that I think is a really interesting one. One of the transitions that you see is that, I'm sure you've seen some of this too, is what makes a great thick client programmer, a guy who can make a PC sing, is his ability to go completely out on an edge, completely out on the ledge beyond what he knows how to do, and to figure out how to operate out there. And what that means is he's taking enormous risks. And when he gets it wrong, the machine crashes and he has to press reboot. Oh well. The problem is when you take that same mentality to building a system that has to run 24/7, 365, it's a freaking nightmare. These are not people who necessarily understand how to build systems with that kind of a notion. Generally, the guy who is used to walking out to the very edge of a ledge, security is not job one. And in these systems, it is. And so that's one of the kind of key transitions that people are going through, is there's a whole collection of different responsibilities when software is a service and not a product that you have to meet for the user's expectations. I want to talk a little bit about what it's like to live as an acquirer in this case. So we talked a little bit about the case that she described where somebody had to show something, had to show the secret sauce in some way, shape, or form. It is a real challenge in our business to go through that process, because the people that you want to look at that code the most are probably the same people you'd like to invent it. And so the minute that you basically put somebody in the position of doing that kind of evaluation, you have to figure out how to insulate them essentially from that kind of activity in their future. And some of those insulations are, 6.5 miles of airspace, and some of them are a sheet of paper. And the challenge is, how do you deal with that? Often the best person, in my case, I know that in the streaming gaming space, 3 years ago, we were talking about Gaikai on Live. 3 years ago, I think I was one of 2 people in the world who had seen every single one of those technologies in person first blush. I think I was one of 2. That also meant that I was probably the worst person in the world to ever start a streaming gaming company, because I basically knew way too much to do that. And so what it's meant is that our strategy, for instance, in being in that space is to probably have to be a licensor, because what we have done is achieved a kind of intellectual basis that makes it impossible for us to make our own. The other strategy is, when you're doing that evaluation, to use an outside expert. And we do that. We will employ people who are not employees of Electronic Arts to render us an opinion that insulates us from direct contact with that. I think that is not used enough. I think it's not used enough for a couple of reasons. One of them is because it costs money. And a bigger problem is you don't know who to get to do it. So I'm pretty lucky. I can call a guy like Tom up, who's a friend of mine, but we don't have no active business relationship at all, and ask him to do one of those kinds of things, and know that I can get a single, I can go, Tom, should I do it or not? And Tom will go, and then that's all I need to know. Now, he'll write a nice report and I'll give it to my boss, but I've gotten to the same place that I would have gotten out of that evaluation. It's very hard for everybody to have that kind of trust in somebody, and so we tend to go get ourselves dirty at the same time. These are decisions you need to make clearly. Let me make one clear point about the social gaming business. It is a business first and a game second. These are generally built, they're built on Oracle databases, boys and girls. There's no other game in the world built on Oracle. So, and so, at the end of the day, it is a business. If you do not build around your business, around your commerce, around the way you're going to get paid, around the responsibilities that come with that payment, around the privacy concerns, it doesn't matter how good your game is, you actually won't make money anyway. And so you have to design around that first. That means you have to accept all those business responsibilities first. That is really the big change. When Tom started building games, Tom just said, I want to build this game. And then we got around to the business later. And it literally was like that. These guys would go 6-7 months into a game development process before they'd even consider how they were going to get paid. Yep. That is you cannot do that in social gaming. You will produce no value during that time.
Yeah, and I'll definitely back that up. When we started moving into the Facebook side of things from a development standpoint, completely on our own, we said we're going to bootstrap this and do it. A large majority of it was our dev team getting up to speed, but issues that you bring up, really good ones, are, we hadn't dealt with large scalability before, and we're the little guy. We were maybe a 20-person studio back then. And, we're running on our own cash. We're burning, the plane is now coming in for a landing, whether it wants to or not.
Right. Out of gas.
Yeah, and basically things like that level of expertise, I as the little guy in Dallas, going out and tapping people was very, very difficult. And either issues with people that, I can tell you all I know, but you can never use it,
right.
Or it's going to cost you a ridiculous amount of money to get this knowledge, and you're going to have to maneuver your plan dramatically in another direction that's going to cost 2 or 3 months of burn, and then we're back to work for hire at that point.
Right.
So it is definitely, that transition was a big challenge, but we employed myself and my business partner, Mark Tardif, we both took the business role and went full steam ahead with as much as we could, trying to tackle these issues early on, hiring a couple engineers that were not super tied to our old space, but more into the social space and had those areas of expertise. I think we did okay. To be frank, I think if we'd finished shipping a game instead of getting acquired, we probably would have walked right into a brick wall. But now it won't be as bad.
All right, well, get ready. Here's my embarrassing quote I'm going to have to explain in 2 days. So I think in the space of social gaming, if you are building the business first, it means that a lawyer is a part of your design team. It just fundamentally, all the lawyers cheer. Come on. So, I think you cannot, so much of social gaming is about designing the line as close to the lines, the legal lines and where other people are as is possible. The precision of that line is probably your margin. If 1 out of 200 customers pays you and you lose one of those customers, that means 1 out of 400 pays you now. These are catastrophic. So you have to drive close to the line to make the business work. To drive close to the line, you better know where it is. And to the greatest extent, we're not populated by a bunch of what I would call terribly careful legal folks in our business. And so if you're going to drive into that business, you better have help, somebody with a bright flashlight who knows where the line is. And
Which is interesting, if I can interject there. A lot of my social gaming clients are trying to hire lawyers, and they're actually having trouble. And this is where those of you who are actually students here in this program should think, you know, the best scenario for an in-house counsel at a social gaming company is somebody who knows social gaming, who knows the history of farming games, the history of, you know, bubble drop games and whatnot, and that can sit down and be part of your greenlighting process. And then ideally, I set it up for clients that you have them be part of the greenlighting process when ideas are thrown out, and then you set up a few gates along the way where you have to clear a lawyer to make sure you don't have a problem, because it's better to solve that problem early than right before launch. And companies are having trouble finding lawyers who know social gaming, who actually know the industry and can be really valuable partners on that game development team. Because having just as somebody who comes in and knows copyright law, that's really not that helpful. You need to have somebody who really knows this industry and the games in the industry and the players in the industry. So I think there's a real opportunity there for people. A lot of companies out there, I think, that are going to need those kinds of in-house lawyers. They're really hard to find.
Yeah, I would add one other thing. The other kind of key, if you are a lawyer who wants to be in this space, figure out how to get a look at a Facebook contract. Figure out how to get a look at an iOS contract. Figure out how to get a look at a Google contract, especially a marketplace-related one, because it's pretty much the core of everything that they do. In every one of those cases, they define the legal landscape to a great extent. When we figure out what we're doing, we lay those kind of things on top of each other and figure out what the open spaces are that we are free to operate, or the business conditions that we can follow up on. So it's kind of a key thing that we spend a lot of time on. I want to talk a little bit about IP next. Maybe that seems like a high one. So I think there are a couple of interesting things. I actually am old enough to have been around when the Broderbund Carmen Sandiego case was actually litigated. And remember how defining that was for our business. Literally, that was the last lawsuit that our business heard about for like 20 years. The video game business has been remarkably void of what I would call intellectual property litigation. In general, patents have not mattered. There have been some, but it's literally been a handful that have had any impact, almost all in the music, on the music side, by the way, which was full of all kinds of other interesting copyright problems. So one of the things that we're having to adjust, EA as a company, and I think the business as a whole, is that social gaming really is a part of the telecommunications industry. And the rules that apply there look a lot more like the telecommunication rules than the gaming business. We're not litigious. Unfortunately, the telecommunications business is. And what we're discovering is we have to learn new tricks. So sometimes we do feel like we're bringing a knife to a bazooka fight, meaning we're so out of touch with what it's like to be. But it also means we're not used to looking where we're going in the same way. So that's brought up a couple of different things. One of them is patents, and the way the patents have impacted our space has dramatically changed. And we increasingly have to figure out what patents are relevant. We find ourselves consistently in the prior art business. That literally is, I think I spend 10% of my time being asked, have you ever heard of a game that did this before 1985? That kind of thing. And Tom knows that's a good contest to play with, Rich, actually. So, so what turns out to be is we're doing that all the time. That's one of those things that you have to be kind of prepared to have a historical context like she was describing to give you the ability to go into those court circumstances and call ridiculous what is ridiculous. And in a lot of these cases, so I'm going to pick on something I don't mean to, but those of us who lived in Silicon Valley always thought Apple suing Microsoft about Windows and Apple OS was silly because they both stole it from Xerox anyway. And so that conversation she was having up there about, Playdom and Zynga, I'm laughing about it because, wait a minute, they stole it from me first. So from my perspective, these circumstances have really changed. In the past, those kinds of things, we would roll our eyes and we'd go make a better version and beat them in the marketplace. That is not the rules in telecom. Telecom believes in preserving their advantage legally if they can, and so they try. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. How do we better survive working in the space of the telecoms, and what are the kind of preparatory processes that we can get better at that help us in that space? You learned any?
Oh, God, to tread lightly. I mean,
be afraid, be very afraid.
It is absolutely about being afraid. It's like knowing you're going into a jungle pretty much naked with no food and water. And
I call it a minefield.
It is a minefield, and I think that as much as you can try and learn and do reconnaissance, you can survive a little bit longer, but I feel that at any given instant, you're smacked and swatted away. And, you know, a parallel to that, certainly for the space that I'm working in, which is all music-based, is that our game, Cred FM, is all based around sharing music, and it's not music that the company has any particular rights to. And we have suppliers, and it's not necessarily music that our customers own or have the rights to, although in some cases they do or they have license. Not that anyone has ever looked at the end user license agreement of iTunes when you click on 99 cents or eMusic or Rhapsody or anything else. So I find that, you know, we're always like, we're on the edge. I'm just waiting for an email or to see in TechCrunch that we're about to be sued. And because we're university related and backed, we have these filters of lawyers who have taken, you know, they're leading with their chins. They're doing the right thing. But they are not intellectual property attorneys. They're not social game attorneys. They're not music attorneys, which would be the most effective because they know how the pirates are robbing from each other, like the Commonwealth in the 16th and 17th centuries. It's all over there. So I just sort of mindfully go along and I go, who's got thick walls right now? And the number one place for music on the web, in case you don't know this, is YouTube. And the reason it's become the de facto choice for other service providers like Cred, et cetera, is because they have a really tall, thick curtain, and it's called Google. And they pay some very minimal rights fees, much lower than anything Spotify is on the hook for right now as the popular music place. So we hide behind them. But at any given moment in time, Google can change and YouTube will change their API, our access points, and what we will have to do to have access to that music. And so as a sustainable business, as I look at Cred FM as a business, and I shop this around to acquirers or further investors, it's like, yeah, but what happens if they change tomorrow? If I don't have music, I don't have much of a game. So that is a fundamental issue of like dealing with telcos and the telco mentality. We want to own it all, and right now we're so busy growing, we can't figure out how to protect it all, so we're going to allow you to take our crumbs.
I think that's, so strategy number one is hide in the weeds, which is to be so small they don't see you. And that works well until you make some money.
Yeah, well, we've discovered that.
Yeah, right. And I think it does still work to some extent. But if you're going to also hide in the weeds, it means you're like every other, you know, creature subject to predation. You better be able to move too. And I think that the most important characteristic that Joseph's describing is that in spite of all the preparation their lawyers have done, in their case, it's probably their nimbleness to react and their ability to invoke the relationships that they have that are going to be key to their success. What are some of the other processes that you've seen work?
So one strategy I think that's a good one to employ in the world of worrying about patents, which Rich touched on, is to sort of go on the offensive. So something that's a strategy we see a lot of bigger companies do, but it works well for small companies, is get your own patents. Hire a patent prosecutor, get all your designers in a room, do an idea generation session with the patent prosecutor, and get some patent applications on file. So that if somebody comes after you with their patent application, assuming it's not a troll, assuming it's an operating entity, so if they come after you with their patent application, you can say, oh, but you actually are in violation of my patents too, and you have almost that mutually assured destruction, which is what we see in the more established tech community has already happened. But I think the patent area is an area we're going to see a lot of things happening. We know Zynga is filing a ton of patents. Yep. And so right now, most of the patent litigation in this space is trolls, so non-practicing entities that just own patents on.
It's going to change so dramatically.
And they're kind of silly, frankly, when I read them. But I think in the next 10 years, that's going to be a big transition in the social gaming space. So I think the best way to protect yourself, little guy, medium-sized guy, big guy, is file your own patent applications, get yourself out there in the game so that you have something to put down on the table against somebody else. That's fantastic. So I think that's what you got to do.
So let me describe. I'll try my best to describe the strategy I'm selling at EA. That doesn't mean I've sold it yet, but our vision is that it's a minefield, and that some of the mines are extraordinarily well marked. You know, Apple marks theirs very well. In fact, Samsung and Apple argue about the ones they mark very well together. Some are not marked. Those are the scary ones, are the ones you do not know are there, that you build your entire product line based on, and there's some It doesn't even have to be a troll. It can just be a 10-year-old patent that's buried in LodgeNet's asset base, for instance, as an example. And if you kind of watch how patents are written, sometimes you will see odd things where they're what I call a notch in the patent, where it tends to write itself around something. That is a danger sign. If you see a patent where they didn't obviously cleave, where they worked around something, somewhere out there is something else they are afraid of, and they've wrote their way around it. So what I've described it at EA is we need to develop a really good map of the landmines. We need to know where things are as best we can, and then we need to build bridges over the places that we're unsure of. Those bridges are built of our own patents. The final thing is you're going to have partners. There are going to be patents you do not own that you need to get your jobs done. She's right. The most valuable thing in that space to own is some patents of your own to trade for them. You do not want to be paying back and forth. You want to be trading access to your intellectual property. Finally, companies like Electronic Arts are increasingly thinking about being in these patent portfolios. And the reason why is they're just large enough to be worth it. You have to decide which ones you're in. Some of them are ironic. So, for instance, there are cases where you can there are a couple that we have considered being in that Zynga's in. And the irony of that, of course, is if you read the tenet of that, it means you can't sue them. We can't sue each other. So it'd be interesting if we joined one of those, whether they stayed. But those kinds of strategies, I think you're going to see us employ a portfolio of those strategies together to manage the risks and the opportunities. For us, though, for the greatest point, you can no longer depend on the goodwill of your competitors. They're not going to behave that way in this space. You have to protect your own real estate, or nobody else will. Let's see here. We've got about, we got a little bit of time. Okay. Let's see here. I want to talk about the slide that's actually, not that one, but where how you discovered you were getting sued in that one case.
Yeah.
Go back to that slide for a second.
Oh, that was a bad
So I want to talk about the use of litigation, both offensively, defensively, and as a source of business development. And I would count this as a source of business development. What I've noticed about this space that was not true about the video game space before is generally if there was a lawsuit filed in the video game space before, people actually cared how it came out. Meaning the two parties who were involved in the suit actually wanted to know what the answer was. The point of the suit was a genuine disagreement between two companies about what this point of law meant to the two of them. I don't think that's what this is about. Increasingly, this is the other tactic that seems to come from telecom, is the shoot the gun first and ask the questions later. I'm not going to tell that story. That's a bad story. I think that this is the thing that is new for us in the business, and the hardest thing that we're having to adjust to is not to overreact to this. So you have to do the things that you're ready to be ready legally for it. You have to deal with the fact that this is essentially a public relations activity as much as it is a litigation activity. And that means that it is probably as important that you have a PR response as a litigious response to this activity. So I think that's the most underestimated thing that I've seen done, is that the small companies go deal with the legal issues and fail to deal with the PR issues.
Well, I think that's the challenge is that, okay, so you've got ranchers and we're homesteaders,
Yeah,
right?
that's the thing. Like, I got a line right here. You and I are kind of the same boat. When you guys are talking about patents, and as a small bootstrap developer, just even discussing the word patent, call it my turn and say, I'm thinking about a patent, and the bill just shoots through the roof.
Yep.
And so now we're talking about hiring. You mentioned earlier, bring on an attorney early on. And as a small developer, I kind of draw a line in the sand early on. If I was going to start a new company tomorrow in this space, I need to have a partner that's in the legal space, and have to give equity to that partner. Or just go the route of the indie developer and I'm just going to do it and see what happens. And
Live in the weeds.
eventually,
That's the live in the
live
weeds
in the weeds
strategy.
as long as possible, or don't live in the weeds and just step on everybody, be super vocal about it, which is what all these indie developers do. Be super vocal about it and then wait for somebody to wrap protection around them later on if they're doing very, very well, or just disappear into the sunset if they don't do very well. So it's a very beginning, from the very, very beginning, got to make those kind of decisions. And without angel investor or investment from a third party or a mountain of cash in the background, it's difficult to come from the beginning and say, we're going to have our game design meetings in my garage and let's bring our attorney buddy in. It's difficult. That said, we're going to have to solve that problem going forward if it's going to continue down this path. These kind of things, if something like that came up at my company prior to this acquisition or even post, yeah, I'd be running around with my head on fire.
Well, I think that the real challenge in looking at creating new independent properties, entertainment properties, are the things that you now have to navigate. It's terms of service that you have to create for your own game. What's your
On top of 3 others.
on top of 3 others, your privacy policy, the issue of who actually owns the transaction within a Facebook Connect universe. Is it Facebook? Because they say they're your agent, but at other times they're saying, no, it's really, they already had existing Facebook credits, so they're really not your customer, they're mine.
Well, but at the same time, yeah, let's talk about one quick point in that context. So one of the things Ted talked about was how there are several things that have changed about in our industry. It's who's playing, it's where they're playing, and how they pay for it. And the how they pay for it part is maybe the most interesting part today. What we learned very early on Godfather of all crazy things, was we built an in-game transaction where the very first time that you were pinned down in a firefight without a gun, a guy would come up and offer to sell you a gun for $1. What percentage of people do you think bought that? 60%. 60% of people who had Xbox Live and had credits bought it. So what did we learn from that? It's good to do the transaction in the game, especially at the right time. What that's led us to do is to recognize that taking people out of the game to execute one of those transactions is unacceptable and deadly friction that we cannot do. That has driven the commerce into the game, but that has created new legal issues. For instance, if I'm on Facebook and I'm using Facebook credits, who's the merchant of record? And in fact, it turns out that depending on what country I'm in, it might completely change. Second of all, if I do that transaction, but I do it with a different cash device, like PayPal, for instance, to transfer in there, who currently owns that merchant of record and who has the currency responsibility? This stuff is a mess. We spend a tremendous amount of our time trying to track that. And then we'll get down to the last thing, which is there's a certain cognitive dissonance from Amazon, from Google at a lesser extent, where because they don't want to deal with local tax issues, they pretend they can't do things. And the problem for me is that I have a retail packaged goods presence in a lot of these places, and I do not get to evade local taxes. And so when Google will not tell me where they sold stuff, I have a real problem, because I basically have to guess. So this is our future. This whole area about the retail side, suddenly people like us stumble into businesses we have never been in before, with responsibilities we have never taken before.
Just pushing.
What have I forgotten? I'm sure I've forgotten something else in retail.
No, I think that's all right. I mean, and then the
Wow.
privacy, and then the privacy issues that come along with
Yeah,
having
yeah.
all that monetization information in addition to personal information, right? So you have people's credit card numbers, their PayPal links, and you have all that financial information. And what do you do with it? And what if somebody hacks in and steals it?
Insulated, I mean, so, you know, we kind of lived through the hacker wars last March. There were instances where people should have gotten credit cards and they didn't. It wasn't because they couldn't, it's because they didn't. In many cases, it's because they got distracted, oddly enough. So, you know, some proportion of what went on last spring was good old-fashioned kids trying to get unprotected PC executables, meaning doing the same thing they've been doing since I've been in the business, trying to steal software. In many cases, they literally went in one door when the credit cards were in the door next door. And you know, we are just lucky that didn't happen this year. What you're going to see as a result is people like Tom are going to say, I never want those credit cards. I don't want to see them. I don't want to
Create
know
layer of
about them.
obfuscation between us and credit cards.
I want nothing to do with that. And maybe that will help defend you from the retailer of record circumstances.
Honestly, that was an issue that came up in part of our due diligence, which was that as a developer, I shipped a couple games on iOS, and I pushed worldwide.
Yep.
And just didn't even care, because Apple, it's a radio dialogue. Okay, yeah, I'll put this out to the world. And then when it came to, so what territories do you operate in? US? Oh, wait. And now I'm listing every single country.
172 territories
all
on
the
iTunes.
territories associated with Google, associated with Apple, associated with everything
Amazon
I've ever
too,
shipped this,
yeah.
this title to. And that created a lot of paperwork associated with our little tiny game. And it's just something that we absolutely in no way,
Actually, in that
shape, or form-
particular case, your paperwork pile was probably longer than your source code.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, that was an interesting revelation. Oh, did you know about this? And no, I didn't. And how are we going to solve it and give it to lawyers and write a more zeros check? So,
And to a certain extent, I think part of it is within Facebook, you know, I feel like I'm a mall merchant. I'm one of those guys in a kiosk. And I'm in for a cheap price. I'm paying $3,500 for a weekend, and I'm hoping it's going to be a good weekend. And if I build it up at any given point in time, Facebook, the landlord can basically bring him in, change my rent. I don't get to control as much as I really feel I need to. And that's just the dynamic. And we know that going in, but knowing going in and then operating in it, you know, it really, there's a pain threshold. And all of a sudden you start looking at what your application and what your service model is, and you really have to go back to what service am I going to be offered to be able to offer a user, a player competitively, so I can still make enough money to do all the things to protect myself and to provide them, you know, some value. And it's really tough. It is of 1,000 different elements, and you have to juggle them in real time. It's a better game than some of the games that are being sold at $60.
It's also, you mentioned, there's a really interesting topic there too. You mentioned we're really standing on the shoulders of Facebook and on the shoulders of Google and on the shoulders of these other platforms, which is interesting because they've got a great API. They let you jump in with a small shop, and I kind of definitely come from a small shop mentality. One of the big issues we face compared to, let's say, a Zinger or somebody that's larger in even Electronic Arts is when Facebook decides arbitrarily on a Thursday or a Tuesday, let's change the API so this happens instead of that. And as a developer, we get about 3-4 hours later, our analytics tell us that something is really wrong, and I got to bring people home.
Something's fallen off a cliff.
We have no idea what's going on.
Or it's broken,
Or it's
period.
broken. And being, guys in Dallas, I don't have anybody I don't have the red line Facebook. Hey, what'd you change? I submit a ticket that's a hidden URL that you got to find once and hope you save it somewhere and wait a week for it to come back. So I have to literally go out and find what the problem is, either by stumbling on it through the analytics, or
You know when you
one of the big boys tells us, oh, by the way, that happened.
when you can call them and complain about it,
Hmm.
and they don't listen to you, it's really the same.
Okay, good. I feel better about that.
Pulling a ticket for Facebook is please. It's like
Having
talking about the
more,
pothole in your street.
quote unquote, having more influence just means you're more frustrated sooner, with less ability to resolve it. I think that's, so, the commerce providers was kind of on my list here. These are different partners. We've had interesting relationships with our retailers in the past. Sometimes they've been fun, and sometimes they've been painful. But this has really been quite different. The relationship that we had with Toys R Us or with EB, for instance, was we felt like it was our customer together. And the vast majority of players in this new commercial space have a very proprietary relationship with their customer. They want to have lots of wives, and they don't want to share any of them. And so the issue for us, I think, is how do we work with a partner who is so devoted to their own existence, really at the expense of everybody else? It's our job to constantly be in the education business for them about what the opportunities are. The good news is that at the bottom of every one of these guys, they all know that game content is pretty much the reason they are where they are today. And so, versus where we were 20 years ago, where we would try and have those discussions, Mr. Jobs was never that happy about having games on his platforms. He was just never that happy about it. And although his customers would buy the stuff and we would do quite well in that business, he was just not that interested. Those things are changing. The folks who run iOS, they know where their bread is buttered. If you don't think that Facebook understands what their revenue base comes from, you need to pay attention more carefully, because they're pretty clear on it. The good news is they're paying attention now and they realize what we do for them. It hasn't changed their behavior very much, but it's meant that we're a part of the conversation. It also means that if we have leadership ideas and innovations that can change their space, they listen now and they don't blow us off. So the key is, when you have those conversations, to make sure that you're managing that as a relationship point of access. And for us, that is the upside. We have been managing essentially a platform agnostic relationship between 3 platform providers for 20 years. That's like having 3 sisters as girlfriends. It's a tremendous amount of work. And we understand that. We understand that it's about making each one of those partners feel special, each one of them feel like they have the things that are necessary to meet their strategy, but without excluding that from the other people involved. What I'm hoping is that the kind of sophistication we've had on those relationships in the past, we can have on the future, especially if we're helping them see the future that can help them. So, as a social gamer, what you offer when you walk through the door at a Facebook or a Google or an iOS shop is you offer them a glimpse of the future that they're looking for. That actually is the asset you have. Don't give it up. If that makes any sense. I have another one on here that's my random thing that I thought's an interesting thing to talk about. I'm going to try at 12. I'm going to try and stop so we have 15 minutes of questions. A big chunk of the social gaming space has been built around the creation and distribution of virtual goods. I think that we are unwittingly walking into a space where we're going to walk between who owns what property. So, for instance, if you sell a bunch of virtual goods in yours, how long do I get to have those things? Now, some parts of the world have solved this in a different place. Anybody here been to Korea or seen any of the Korea gaming constructs? Obviously, I know you have, but anybody else? So one of the things that's most interesting about that is if you watch, generally what you get are not possessions they wear. Meaning that you will buy a piece of clothing on MapleStory, and 7 days later it's rags. What that does is a couple things simultaneously. First of all, it builds churn for the business. Good idea, by the way, good idea. But second of all, it clearly creates a sunset for your ownership of that item. That does a couple of things at the same time. One of them is it manages your expectation of how long you own it by design. Number two is it frees up database space for me, that I don't have to carry a bunch of dead stuff around in my database to manage your relationship. That is not what's been happening in the US so far. Even we have done SimSocial with some reasonable expectation you're going to have those devices for a while, those items for a while. I'm waiting for the first person who gets very upset when they lose their Diamond Tiara. So I don't know if you've seen any of this happen.
Well, I actually haven't seen it play out in litigation yet, but we've definitely anticipated it. It comes up a lot in counseling for me when you talk to clients about who are going to sunset a game.
Yeah, it's
right.
really-
So
it's hard to
these
do that,
games
by
are
the
not
way.
going to be around forever, and you're going to sunset a game because it's no longer making money for you, and it's not worth the time of maintaining it. So what do you do with all the virtual goods people have purchased in
And
that
by
game?
the way, it is your worst security vulnerability. Usually the older the game you run, the older the server, the more it is your problem. It is the place that people come to it is the door that people break into. And so the problem that you've got is this double-edged sword where you've got a collection of customers who have an expectation of continuing service, and there really aren't enough of them to pay the bills. And on top of that, who's walking through their front doors every Tom, Dick, and Harry with a shotgun. And so the problem for us is, how do you manage those two relationships?
So the only place I've ever had it come up actually was in this Vastu situation when they were trying to shut us down in Brazil, and we went into the Brazilian courts and we actually used a consumer protection argument to say, don't shut these games down. There are 35 million users playing these games, many of whom have spent real world money to buy things for their cities and their farms and their pets. And if you shut this game down, they're going to lose their hard-earned money. So it was a compelling argument, I think, but I think it's just a matter of time before there's some sort of consumer class action about, Electronic Arts sunset this game or Disney sunset this game, and I want my
Or just a service
virtual goods
outage.
back.
Or just a service outage. I mean, all that needs to happen is a service outage before the client database has been written to the central database, and you will lose those transactions.
That's happened at 99.999% for Amazon. There's that 0.001% where they're down for 3 hours and everything you've done is toast.
Yeah, if you're dependent on them,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
So I think we are too, but in a different way.
In some ways.
In a different way.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing on the perspective. I would advise you, as a game designer, to think about where or sunsetting in the fundamental way that you sell things to people. There are things you can sell them on a permanent basis, recognize the responsibilities that come with that, but otherwise, there is no particular good reason to do that. In fact, it's probably bad for your business model. So you can manage a legal exposure and make your business better by simply making a different game design decision in that particular case. Let's see here. Next on my list are gaming in the world. So one of the things Ted talked about is the notion that my game lives on multiple devices. We call this notion metagaming at EA. It's the notion that the game is everywhere you are. There are a couple of things that I'm going to add onto your presentation with a couple of points that define how big that trend is. The original core of our business was very brand aligned. If somebody owned a PlayStation 3, they would never buy a DS. Never, ever buy a Nintendo DS unless they were in the business.
Mhm.
But the vast majority of people, they were Sony guys, they were Nintendo guys, and they were Xbox guys. They did not cross the streams. There was no crossing those lines. The new audience, which is, 10 or 20 times as large as that old audience, they don't care. They don't think about the world that way at all. What they care about is, does it run on the device that I have in my hand at this moment in time or where I am? When that is true, it means their notion of metagaming has to cross all of those places. The other thing I will tell you is that once you get to this audience, you are really no longer competing for their money, you're competing for their time. And if you let them wander off your game on some other device because they happen to be on it and you're not there, you may not get them back. You certainly won't get them back the same way that you wanted to. So metagaming is a very important tool for getting that accomplished. The challenge for us is that metagaming means piercing the walls of all of these walled gardens out there and making all the selfish giants happy at the same time about that. Our strategy, I think, is going to be to try and provide so much value outside the castle that they open the door for us, and that they do it because it makes their customer happy at the same time. But that's going to be an interesting question over the next several years, is how do you integrate an audience that very much reflects what I would call the Google land view of the world, which is everything's open, with the most predominant commercial models today, which are increasingly closed. And some, both Microsoft and Apple, are trying to close formerly open markets. And so this conflict is going out there between the fundamental tendencies of their customers and the commercial tendencies of the masters of that intellectual property. That is a contest that we are going to be the lubricant of. We're going to be the grease in that wheel. We're going to have to figure out how to solve those problems between those platform owners and those commercial guys. Anybody got anything to add to that? Did I overdo that?
Well, no, I think you've described a strategy that works for Electronic Arts as an ongoing business of mass entertainment. And for those of us who are just aspiring game makers or want to be creators and have an audience and have a business, you know, we can't necessarily compete in the same way, but we're very cognizant of the fact that
I'm so big that I have to build me a door or I don't get in. Okay? Now, what I think is true is the weeds approach for you guys is the right one, which is those castles have big bricks with big holes between the bricks.
The good part about that is sometimes we early will get into an initiative that
Yep.
you guys may not get into, which is both, it's double-edged sword, because sometimes that gets us ahead of the curve, sometimes it makes us
A target.
the pioneer with the arrows in the
Yeah.
back, so.
sometimes you're dinner, sometimes you are about to be dined.
Exactly, yeah. But that is definitely, you mentioned this earlier with the Three Sisters. It's the same problem in the console space, same problem with Google and Apple and everybody else. You end up, the more that they're gonna give access across that walled garden, the more you're gonna have to specialize for them.
You'll have to create unique value for them.
And that adds, we had more bodies to make that happen, add more legal issues to make that happen, and we're also have a user expectation on this platform because of some feature that Apple has that doesn't exist on this platform in any way, shape, or form, and because we don't have that, because they don't have that, we're at fault, so.
But I think that what happens is that I'd like to think that we're reasonably smart, you know, we have a bunch of smart people on the team, and we're strategically very much aligned with the ubiquity of our application and that it should and could live any place. The reality is I don't have the resources to do it all. So I have to take a stand and figure out where am I going to get the highest return and balance that against what the investors' expectations are in terms of our traction points for future investment. And when everyone says that you need to be on an iDevice, it's like, okay, here are the costs, here are the trade-offs, here are the marketing costs, you know, hard cash as well as soft, and where you're going to be. So Meta works, but, you know, and I can't be like, you know, Meta World Peace, you know.
Well, I think you have to, it's a client decision, how many clients do you make? You can build a meta game that runs only on the web.
Mhm.
And that's one approach that defines the fidelity and the immersiveness of some of your choices. Although increasingly, you know, we talked about that at dinner last night, those distinctions are closing. We have seen some pretty impressive work that we've gotten out of HTML and WebGL, and so maybe that's the other closure on this is the web continues to be open, and that might be the one way, that might be the one door they always keep open.
Well, I think
But there's some fundamental decisions you have to make there about so a lot of times on the console platforms, you want to put your database and all your user access behind a very, very secure closed wall that Microsoft or Sony or anybody will not even remotely let anyone else into. To publish that to the web, you've got to do some real interesting stuff.
Oh, but it's fun.
It is very fun.
It's fun to do security. So I've been given the 5-minute notice about 4 minutes ago. So so I want to open it up for questions. We should have a lot. Yes, ma'am.
I just have two quick questions. My first question is, do you think games such as Skyrim, Gears of War, Halo type games will ever come to a social networking Facebook type platform? And my second question is,
That looked like a grade play to me.
Yeah.
So let's see, the first question was, do we think that we will see immersive, high-quality AAA immersive games ever emerge on Facebook? Why don't we let Tom start?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right now, some really cool stuff's happening with Flash that makes games 3D, and that's a step in a direction that a lot of us are in. And as developers, like as a hardcore developer that's working on a Gears of War game, and they just don't even care about things like Facebook, somebody comes along and says, hey, you should add like a Facebook button that does some sharing of some kind, and they get a little bit of a taste of, wow, 80 million people hit share on this game because it's a huge game. Well, that's a pretty interesting set of features I want to, and suddenly we're pulling pieces over. And Rich can speak to this a little bit. You guys did Dragon Age on Facebook.
Lots of other ones, yep.
A distilled version. So I think we'll see distilled versions of games that, I can very much see a Call of Duty-esque thing appearing on Facebook. It's going to engage people in that space. I can see all that kind of stuff.
Just because you can get Lord of the Rings on a TV set in your bedroom at home doesn't mean that you're going to say that's the same quality of experience as being in the theater. At various times, you'll want to consume various things. And one of the things we talked about last night was the ubiquity of time and session, and the fact that on smaller screens, smaller footprints in our mobile lives, it's the frequency of entertainment options, of instantaneous reward as opposed to deep and immersive.
Yeah,
That
it's
doesn't,
granularity times frequency. It's how big are the pieces that you eat, and how often do you play them? So Facebook, those tend to be 90 to 120-second bites,
Yep.
25 or 30 times a day. The average mobile application, they're about 90-second game plays in the 20 times a day fashion. There are whole game forms that dictates to. By the way, that's not a new thing. 90 seconds at a time is coin op. That is exactly what coin op is.
and that's what we learned about the music games, is that music doesn't work in 90 seconds. It does not on any level, other than for sort of discovery. And that's about it.
Not since the 50s when they had minute and 50 seconds.
Correct.
It's been a long time.
Now tracks are 350, 420, and that changes the dynamics of what we were trying to do. And so we're literally looking at some other things that come out of that, and the fact that these are saying, well, I got to the first 20 seconds of the song and then I had to tab out.
I'll answer your other question quick.
No, you won't.
I guess I won't.
I guess I want
Yes, sir, in the back.
I have a question for Carolyn. I'd like to know how useful is or would design patterns be for game elements or devices?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it can't hurt to start to get them, but I think it's a question of how much they'll be able to be used. I mean, I think, the look and the feel and the knockoff, all that's happening, right? I mean, people are using them. You see Apple increasingly using them to enforce their design patents. So I think at this point it can't hurt to do it, but we'll see.
Just to be clear, I own 17,000 video games. I own 17,000 video games. I inventoried them this year, that's why I know. But what the net effect of that is, that's in a tremendous swim of prior art. So one of the issues that you're going to have here is, you're going to either end up with such a narrow application within a patent space, or you're going to get obliterated later on by prior art. And the question is simply going to be, how successful are companies like mine in finding and applying those prior art to keep those spaces open, because that's pretty much our only alternative in that case. But I think they're worth doing for defensive reasons alone. I think that's what Carolyn's saying. But my concern is, I think virtually almost everything in the gaming space has been done 50 times.
But my question is particularly with respect to design patterns, which, novelty requirements and obvious requirements are different from patents, so it's much easier to get a design pattern.
True.
So my question is, when it comes to litigation, I'm a prosecuting lawyer, okay? So I would like to know, when it comes to litigation, sometimes I know some other jurisdictions, I'm thinking, for example, in South Africa, used to practice, design patterns are much easier to enforce than copyright space. Right? And the copyrights to approve originality and to approve the origin and the authorship and all those parts. So my question is, purely from a litigation point of view, you had a client who you were going to represent in court, would it help you, or would it be irrelevant whether or not they had design patterns for some game elements?
Well, I mean, I think it's objection, incomplete hypothetical. It kind of it kind of depends on the situation. I mean, I think it depends on your game. But I do see people out there enforcing design patents more and more now. So I guess my view would be, obviously there's the cost problem. It is true when you call up the patent prosecutors, it costs money. But because this industry is so fluid and we don't know how it's going to play out, I'd err on the side of getting them and trying to use them. But it just depends on the game and the patent.
I think it's
Chime in for a second. I have done litigation on design patents, and the prior art issues, I remember spent 6 months and have the question go out to industry to gather prior art. It's a costly process as well. So the litigation for design patents doesn't mean that it's cheaper, it's time cumbersome. And also that and when you talk about when you litigate, which district court you're going to litigate it in, that also creates certain pressures there.
It's going to be, clearly there are companies like Apple that believe a lot in them. And that's the one other thing I would add to this is, you know, when I play in sports, I do the things that are necessary to win. If my competitor is going to behave in a particular way, I either have to mitigate that, have a defense against it, or I have to play that game. So to some extent, I think this is the competitive context that you operate in. You have to do what's necessary, and I think that's a good example of that. Yes, sir.
I have a question for you about strategy for small businesses, startup companies. And
Just talk to these guys then, not me.
Yeah, I like the weeds idea. So why isn't it a good strategy to start the company, ignore the legal issues, because if you try to get a patent, it's going to cost you tens of thousands of dollars and a lot of management, where you get to focus in on making a game. And make the game, make money, get sued, shut the company down, start over again.
So what do you guys think? I have an answer.
And considering also a lot of these small games that you're making on these platforms are cost you $100,000 or $200,000 to make, well, then you're spending $50,000 just to get a patent on something that you don't even know, and then you have to litigate if you're really thinking about it, or you can use it defensively. But you have to go into all these litigation to shut the company down and start over again.
You say the word litigation to a startup, and you were taking our football and going home.
Yeah, they change businesses.
Full stop.
Yeah.
It's just.
I'm thinking about payday loans now. That's what I'm thinking about.
It's Hope McDonald's hiring this week. I mean, you end up in real trouble in this situation. So early on, like, you try to just fly under the radar. I mean, the weed strategy works very well until you get to a point where you have something of significant value, or you very early on plan for some significant value and do everything in your power to align the dominoes in the way that when you're ready to put that out, that they're going to fall in an order that at least gets you some protection. And if they don't, then you're in trouble. And if you do, and it works well, then your buying partner, your friends, or whatever you're partnering with is going to end up owning that risk instead of you. And I think that's really important. So you definitely have to think of it. The strategy I mentioned, the indie developer strategy of just, let's just do it again, start over. I don't think that's a good strategy generally. You got to.
Well, it's certainly not if you have these things called investors.
Yeah,
They have a completely different perspective, and they know that they're in a risky position. They're doing startups. They come in, unless it's your mom and your dad or, you know, real angel money. Investors, they've got their eyes open. They see what they want to see, but their eyes are still open. And if you know in the back of your head as the guys trying to put something together that you are at risk because you're about to take Blazinga's latest game and you've already put the front end code on your server, you're going to get yourself into trouble. And I think that most of us who want to try and do something new, we're motivated because we think we're clever. We think this music thing that we're working on has a lot of merit to it. Time and our audience will tell over the next time whether we were right or wrong, and there'll either be a better reward or not. What I tend to do is that we've borrowed a lot of other people's heavy lifting from use of very talented attorneys as far as terms of services, our users, our rights. We get guidance from our USC attorneys because they are the deepest of deep pockets in terms of a minority stake in our enterprise. And oh yeah, Facebook and Zynga also offer some guidance in terms of what their approaches are. And so you take all that in and then you close your eyes and you go forward because that's why you're here. and you look at the consequences at a given moment in time. I can tell you that if any of the three major labels name us in a suit, we will be done, stopped, within about 0.2 of a second that it's up on TechCrunch, because USC's just basically said,
No stomach for that.
yeah, they have none.
I thought I'd give her the answer, and then
No,
I'll.
I'm okay, that's fine.
So I've got two numbers and a word. The word is lunch.
Yep.
And the two numbers are 3. You're gonna end with question here, there was a question there, and a question in the back, way in the back. And then the other number is 12, which is exactly where we are right now. So that, you can make them really great answers to some great questions.
Okay, I want to add one little thing to that last point. There are 2 reasons to start a company. One of them is because you like the idea of the company, you want the company to be successful. The other reason is to get found. That strategy that you described is a great strategy if you're an independent talent without financing that wants other people to find you. Because when you get stepped on by a big guy, when you have a clever idea, all of their competitors pay attention and come call on your door.
There is a case, in that sense, if you're litigating, you're doing something right, maybe.
Yep. Yeah, I agree with it. It means it's worth it. It means it's worth it.
Yeah.
Sorry, so you had people picked out.
My question was going to be similar there, but I'll just add to that as well. I mean, it's great to be creative and it's great to go off and do things and bootstrap, but use risk mitigation. Like Carolyn, I'm sure your services are not cheap, as most attorneys are not, and patents aren't always the way to go, but some strategic advice about where the pitfalls are with what your idea is by having an attorney at least look over the idea are very helpful. And then again, to jump on Joseph's things, I would advise to use a lot of the resources that are out there. The big companies have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars getting their terms of service and their privacy policies in a way that work, more than that. So it's worth it to jump on the backs of those and then try to tailor them with your company, and then use the services of somebody like Carolyn to kind of just look over your final work and make sure that you're at least getting some sort of protection.
Well, one resource that's out there right now that I'm increasingly seeing smaller companies use is these contract-based general counsels. So there are services that, from whom you could get a contract-based lawyer at a pretty affordable price. A lot of these lawyers, frankly, are women who've decided they can't do the big law firm thing. They want to do their own thing in order to manage and balance life in there. And a lot of these guys are great. And my husband is at a startup, and that's what they use. They use these great people who are really skilled and talented, who you can get on a contract basis to be sort of a contract-based general counsel to get to know your company, but at a much lower rate than a law firm, and probably less expensive than hiring them full-time.
The thing about that too is if you can find one of those who's active in this particular space,
Exactly.
you get all of that great work that they're doing with all these other companies.
The network effect.
Combined, the network effect.
Every music attorney that we talked to said, you guys are effing nuts. And we're going to wait for you to be sued within 30 days. And we ignored all their advice. You have to.
Real quick point there. You have to be able to find an attorney that will, and it's difficult, honestly. You have to find an attorney that understands the space and is willing to say, here, give you percentages on the risks. Because most of the
Give you
attorneys-
analog, not digital
Exactly.
advice.
Most attorneys tell you, don't do that. Here's the piece of paper that says you're going to get sued, and then that's all I'll give you. And you want someone that's going to be able to come in and say, it's a 20% chance, 30, something. Give you some odds to run forward.
One more, right?
So 3 has become, 2 has become 1 because 2 left, so.
I have a bit of a hypothetical. Given
Objection.
Well,
She beat me.
It's a
comment
study.
on nibble bit if you like, but I'll give you the hypothetical as a shield. One of the things that's really attractive about having a small social company is you can bootstrap it with 3, 5, 6 guys. As long as you keep your overhead down, if you're making $100 grand a month, everybody's happy. When you start dragging in lawyers and all kinds of massive protections, the overhead burden gets so great that you couldn't keep the lights on with what some of the small developers make at their studios. So my question is, if you could rewind the clock 6 weeks, what would you tell Nimblebit, the guys there's 3 folks who did Tiny Towers, was a National Game of the Year. It's now being, let's say, there's a generous homage being paid to it by Zynga.
Inspired. Actually, they just started suing them 2 hours ago. I just understand.
My advice is, if you're not in a position to defend yourself, you must innovate. And I think that's the unfortunate fact. In that case, what you have to do is as I was kind of describing before, it's now their calling card. That's kind of the best they've got. Either that or they got to go find a sugar daddy. So my joke about this, it's only kind of, this shows that paying attention, how many, we have lawyers here. You're all Trivial Pursuit fans, right? Trivial Pursuit pays. Are you ready? So I own a piece of a small guitar company called Alembic. They're a tiny Northern California company famous for making John Paul Jones's bass, John Entwistle's bass, John McVie's bass. Apparently, if you're named John, you buy our bass. So these are $9,000 instruments. These are very high-end instruments. We couldn't get alembic.com, but we could get bass.com. So because we were best known for making basses, we got bass.com. Well, after we'd owned it for about 5 years, we got a note from the Bass Shoe Company telling us that we had to vacate our existing thing, and if not, they were going to sue the bejeebus out of us. Now, Alembic is not a big company. They're about your size, and the Bass Shoe Company is a scary thing. But what I remembered from Trivial Pursuit was that, what's the oldest 2 trademarks in the world? Anybody know?
Bass.
The Bass Ale Diamond and the Heineken Red Star. And there's an argument about which one is older. What that meant was that I needed to go find a bigger bully. So what we did is we called up the Bass Ale Company and said, would you like BASS.com? If you get us alembic.com, we'll give it to you. So we made that deal, and the best part is the Bass Shoe guy got nothing. Nothing.
I love it.